Okay. Welcome you all to this mega web interaction on COVID-19. Uh, as we know that COVID-19 is has become a major issue in India also. We have more than 4 lakh of case. But many a time we get information about the our experience, Indian experience on COVID-19. So today, this mega web interaction is basically a Chess Council of India initiative. This is a brainchild of our trustee, Dr. Krishna sir. So in this, we will have no presentation or no panel discussion. This will be an one to interaction where we will ask audience can ask directly question to our topic masters. So we have two highly eminent topic masters here. I welcome Dr. Amita Nene. Ma'am is a head of the department and senior consultant in Department of Pulmonary Medicine in Bombay Hospital, Mumbai, and Dr. P.S. Shahjahan. Sir is an additional professor of pulmonary medicine in government TD Medical College in Kerala. So our topic masters are from two most affected state where COVID-19 has become a very serious issues. So we will try to discuss everything from the clinical presentation of COVID-19 from the uh, basic things, and also we'll try to discuss regarding how we evaluate what are the investigation modalities that we need, what are the recent updates on it, and what are the treatments available. So I request the audience to kindly put the question in a sequence way so that we can uh, do the discussion in a serial wise. So I welcome the topic masters, and I request them to
Yes.
So we're having already few questions. Uh, so I request Dr. Nene to kindly give overview of common symptoms of COVID-19 and their peculiarity in Indian population.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kripesh, for moderating the session. I'd like to thank Dr. Krishna, Dr. Pradeep Narayan, Dr. Narendra, and Dr. Ravi Dosi of Chess Council of India for basically planning such an important webinar and making it into an interactive session. I'm so happy Dr. Shah Jahan, a very well-known and experienced chess physician, is to be my co-speaker today. So it's a very important question that you have asked about the common presentations. So we all know that most common presentation is of respiratory tract involvement. Patients present with fever, cough, chest pain, breathlessness, running nose or throat pain. These are the most common symptoms, but what we need to understand is that very often presentation is not chest. Some people just present with myalgia, anorexia, or abdominal symptoms like vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, whereas some people can have symptoms of headache or loss of nose smell, loss of smell and loss of taste. So basically, and sometimes patients only present with rashes. So presentation can be really very, very variable.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Then we are getting many questions. So, and again, one question from the audience. This question is to Dr. Shahjahan sir. What are the atypical ways COVID can present, and how asymptomatic people are risk of spreading the disease to others?
So, very good evening. I'm very happy to be with Dr. Kripesh, Dr. Nini, and also Chess Council because this is a wonderful platform to discuss our Indian experience and our concerns, controversies, confusions, etc. And your question itself is a confusion question because just like our tuberculosis or HIV, corona can present like any symptom with as the common symptoms are already mentioned by Dr. Nini. We can present with many atypical symptoms. We never suspect corona in such cases. now the dictum is that we should suspect in any person COVID suspect unless proved otherwise. In our center, we have over more than 200 cases so far. Many patients present with headache alone. Many patients present with the malaise alone. There is no history of contact with a suspected case of fever or respiratory cases with the headache alone, diarrhea alone, and diarrhea and headache. And some patients, even a few, 1 to 2 persons present with some neurological issues, some confusion, some maybe we thought of some hyponatremia cases, especially old age people. They came as positive later. So in our setting, we have to suspect all the cases as COVID unless proved otherwise. And coming to the next part, you said the asymptomatic person. Actually, initially we thought the symptomatic patients will cause aerosol generation and causing a lot of problems. But now we realize that these asymptomatic persons, or better pre-symptomatic people, create a lot of problems. One thing, unlike our old SARS or MERS, during the asymptomatic period, or 80% of the transmission occurs during this asymptomatic period. That is one of the most important issues. Second thing, now universal masking is important as per law, but the issue is that many patients are not using mask, and even if someone they usually do not use it properly. So what happens if suppose someone speaks to you for 5 minutes? It is equivalent to cough or sneezing, generating more than 3,000 droplets. So asymptomatic patients are more dangerous than the symptomatic patients, because once a symptomatic patient comes, we will all have some precautions, some protocols, at least we fear something. But an asymptomatic persons come and sitting together and speaking to you, violating all the social distancing norms. It's a big issue. So I believe we have to be cautious about the asymptomatic patients more often. You cannot say asymptomatic patients. Any person who is not being tested for COVID, and we should suspect in such cases as COVID, suspect at least.
I would like to give an interesting, Dr. Kripesh, I totally agree with Dr. Shahjahan. I want to just give a very clinically interesting example. So we had this staff nurse in our hospital. She kept on getting nightmares every night for 7 full days. And she never used to get nightmares before. And what came into her, that she just went and got the COVID test done, and a COVID test came positive. And her CRP and ferritin was high. She had no other symptoms. And we actually gave her HCQ, and her nightmares actually stopped after 7 days. So I thought this was really very interesting presentation. And I would have never really suspected, nightmares being a presentation of COVID. And lots of patients, we are also getting with plain abdominal symptoms of gastroenteritis, and they are turning out to be COVID positive. So I kind of feel in today's pandemic state, everything is COVID unless proven otherwise, whether symptoms or no symptoms.
Yes, yes, ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Nene and Dr. Shahjahan for this introduction. So we can conclude that COVID has some classical presentation where we can make a proper diagnosis, or index of suspicion goes high, and sometimes we have atypical presentation as well. So in our clinical practice, we have to keep all this in our mind, so that we can diagnose or suspect them early and treat them also early. Again, we have a question from Dr. Ganesh Pratap from Karnataka. So he has asked one question, that symptomatically and radiologically positive, but if we see a RT-PCR is negative of COVID-19, how we have to approach to such patient? Should we treat, or we should isolate, or how we evaluate those kind of patients?
Can I take this answer? Okay, so I'll take the question. Yeah, so very, very important, because very often clinically the patient sounds like COVID, and we know that HRCT, I don't know whether X-ray or HRCT what we are talking about, but if X-ray or HRCT are showing subpleural opacities, then we know that 99% of times this is going to be COVID. But RT-PCR we want to always send to confirm, although clinically and radiologically we are suspecting. But we all know that RT-PCR, even if done in the best possible way with the nasal and oral swab both taken, the sensitivity is around 70%. So the thing is that if you are suspecting COVID, then you must repeat your RT-PCR swab 24 to 72 hours later. And very often in our patients, the third swab has actually come positive. I kind of feel that though you're very, very sure, it would always be important to keep on trying more and more efforts to prove your diagnosis.
Can I add
Okay,
one point? Can I add one point, Dr. Kripesh?
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
As Dr. Nini correctly said, the RT-PCR is okay. But the issue in our country is another issue also, because the swab taking. See, now our healthcare workers, initially they were all very few cases. Now they are burned out with a lot of cases, and they are even afraid to take the case swabs properly, nasal swabs or nasopharyngeal swabs. So many a time it is becoming a headache for our we as administrators find it difficult to take the correct methodology. And many of our junior colleagues do not know how to take swabs properly, and our END people is really burdened with this issue. So if you don't take the swab correctly, the results of RT-PCR will be much low. That is again an issue. So an RT-PCR negativity or whatever test available negativity cannot be considered as a foolproof evidence of COVID-19.
I totally agree with you. And just to add on more, as you rightly said, that there are number of factors which make RT-PCR falsely negative. So as you rightly said, we must remember that every patient must have a nasopharyngeal and oropharyngeal swab. So swab has to be taken correctly. Like when the nasopharyngeal swab is taken, you actually have to feel the pain in the tympanic membrane, and the patient is supposed to get a tear in his eyes. And when we do the oral swab, it's supposed to cause gagging of the patient, and the patient is supposed to be coughing. So normally when we send a patient for swab, we warn them that make sure this happens. If it's not done, please tell the person to take the swab again. So the first thing is both the swabs, second is correct technique. But even if this is done, there are certain factors like if the viral load is low, or if at all the viral transport medium, it's not immediately put the swab into it, or sometimes if you have inadequate genes. So the thing is that for diagnosis you require 2 genes, but sometimes the patient will have only 1 gene. So if any of these things are also there, then the swab could be falsely negative. So the dictum is, if you're suspecting COVID, then even if the swab is negative, please repeat a second swab, third swab, but try to confirm your diagnosis, because it will help you as to how to approach the patient further, especially if the patient becomes bad.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Again, we have a question that has been asked by many of the audience. This question especially for Dr. Nene. What are the tests available for diagnosis of COVID, their advantage, disadvantage? So in short, how we evaluate a COVID patient?
Thank you very much, because this is actually area of my special interest, molecular diagnostics. I'm very happy this question has come to me. So basically the thing is that we know that RT-PCR is the gold standard. So we have 3 types of RT-PCR which are available currently in our country. So one is the conventional RT-PCR, which is the gold standard, which we have been using right from day one. The only thing is that the test the test results come out after about 6 hours. And therefore, usually in the best settings, results are available in 24 hours. You give the sample in the morning, by next day afternoon, you get the results. So 24 to 36 hours, but RT-PCR is the best. Sometimes it may just so happen that patient needs to undergo an emergency surgery. So in that case, sometimes we may not be able to wait for 24 to 36 hours. So then we have 2 other RT-PCR tests which come to our rescue. So the first one is TrueNat. As we know, this is basically TrueNat is a machine which is developed by an Indian company based in Bangalore. And we've been using TrueNat for diagnosis of TB also. So basically when we do TrueNat, it's got 2 steps. Again, it's an RT-PCR test. We use the swab for this. And the thing is that the first part is the screening test, where we look for the E gene. If the test comes negative, then the test is negative. But if the test comes positive, then we do a confirmatory test for RDRP gene. And if this comes negative, then no COVID. But if it comes positive, then COVID is confirmed. You don't need to repeat an RT-PCR test to confirm. So basically, TrueNat technically takes 2 hours, and the results could be available to you within 12 hours. Again, the sensitivity is almost 70%, but the conventional RT-PCR is better. It's the best. So if you want to diagnose COVID in a patient, please always do RT-PCR. But if you have some emergency like surgery, then either TrueNat, or even a better thing is GeneXpert, because in GeneXpert you can put 4 cartridges at the same time, and the result is done in one step. In 45 minutes, you have the report available. So if you have GeneXpert, that will be the best. If not, TrueNat, GeneXpert and TrueNat are rapid RT-PCR only for those patients who may require surgery. But for us physicians to be diagnosing COVID, I would definitely recommend RT-PCR, the conventional one. In addition to this, we have other tests also, rapid antibody and rapid antigen tests. But again, the RT-PCR is the best. I mean, I would definitely recommend that as far as possible.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. I would like to request Dr. Sajan if sir would like to add any thing to this.
She has wonderfully presented the issue. No, there are so many other questions, so there is no point to add actually. That is the current guideline and current evidence.
So, okay. So basically, as we know that for diagnosis, RT-PCR is the best. But now rapid antigen tests, which have just got validated like about 4 days back. I'd just like to touch upon this. As of now, at least it's not available in Bombay, but hopefully it will be soon available. It's validated by ICMR and AIMS. So basically, this is a point of care test, you know. So the thing is that it's a rapid antigen, it's a kit which is available. So you take the nasopharyngeal swab. The kit only gives you a viral buffer. So you mix the swab in the buffer, and from this you take with a dropper 3 to 4 drops and you put it in the well of the kit. And within 15 minutes, it shows you the result and you match it with negative positive. So if it comes positive, then COVID is diagnosed in 15 minutes. And if it comes negative, then you have to confirm it again with RT-PCR. So again, RT-PCR is the best, but this could be done quickly for patients who require surgery. And then of course, we have rapid antibody tests, which are mainly for epidemiological purposes, surveillance purposes, and it tells you about your immunity, especially for healthcare workers. If our IgG is positive, then probably we got asymptomatic infection, you know, and we are probably fit to continue with medications fit to continue with work, you know, especially for elderly people, elderly healthcare workers.
Thank you, ma'am.
With the antigen testing, the specificity, it is highly specific, 100% specific, but at the same time, it is only 80% sensitive actually. That is the issue. 1 out of 5 patients will miss actually. But anyway, it will be a useful procedure for immediate procedures like for us for bronchoscopy or even electric procedures, etc. etc. That's important.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, so the positive is definitely positive, but if it's negative, then
that's the issue.
The advantage is that you know which patient is positive. That is, so point of care.
How long it will take to reach in India? It just in US only.
Available in India. It's a Korean company which is producing it.
Yeah, it's coming.
ICMR has validated it about 4 days back. So soon in Bombay, we are expecting it in a week's time to be available.
Okay.
So,
thank you, Dr. Sajan. Dr. Nene. So we can again, before proceed to further management person, we again got a very interesting question from Dr. Sadananda Barik from Orissa. He has asked one question: what are the symptoms in an immune compromised person? So I request Dr. Sajan sir to kindly provide explain the question.
Immune compromised patients.
Yes, sir.
So far, we have, to my experience, we have seen, I already told you, some 150 to 200 patients in our institution. And so far, none of the patients had any florid evidence of immune suppression except for diabetes. Many of them are diabetic, but we didn't find any special symptoms or altered symptoms associated with the diabetes, even among uncontrolled diabetics. We have seen so many uncontrolled diabetics, those who are said to be controlled prior to the development of COVID, but the symptoms are more or less same. I didn't find anything special or anything unusual, as we said earlier. Any symptoms can be a part of COVID, but no altered symptoms or additional symptoms with the. But I have not seen any HIV patients with COVID. I have not seen any patient with an organ transplantation patient with the COVID. Only those with the diabetes.
I agree with Dr. Shahjahan. Just that the thing is in Bombay, we are like, Kerala is blessed, you all have controlled COVID much faster.
You might have seen so many cases. Yeah.
We have the dubious distinction of being the #1 city in India right now. So unfortunately, we are seeing very, very sick patients. What we are basically seeing is that immunocompromised patients, especially patients who are on steroids. So the thing is that they are not getting fever. And as a result of that, they are presenting later. So very often they are presenting when they already have a pneumonia because the fever is getting masked because of steroids, and very often they are presenting with abdominal symptoms. But by the time they present to us, they are already very bad. They are moderate to severe by the time they present to us. So they are coming into us much more sick. Otherwise, the presentation is just the same. Patients on steroids sometimes don't have high fever. That's the only thing.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nene, Dr. Sajan. So we can conclude that COVID presentation among the immune compromised and immune competent person will be more or less same, so not much different. So again, coming to one thing that we healthcare worker are in a on 24/7 are on duty to treat this COVID patient. So we are at the risk of getting exposed to it. We have again asked a related question to the exposure to the healthcare worker from Dr. Zakir Hussain Sheikh from Telangana and Dr. Dayananda Krishna Kumar from Telangana. Their question is more or less same. What is the post-exposure prophylaxis for doctors and healthcare worker who are asymptomatic but found swab positive on routine screening? So, in short, how will evaluate those healthcare workers who get exposed to a patient and who are not using a proper PPE? So, the question I think request to Dr. Nene ma'am.
Okay, so the thing is that, this prophylaxis is basically a very controversial topic. So we have people who believe in prophylaxis, and because this prophylaxis is only recommended by ICMR, so there are people who believe in it, people who don't believe in it. So basically, I'm a believer of HCQ prophylaxis. So I basically feel that healthcare workers who are going to be involved in COVID care, or actually I would say any healthcare worker today who's going to be working where there's a lot of COVID everywhere, I would definitely recommend that they should be taking HCQ prophylaxis, the dose being 400 BD the first dose, and then 400 OD every week. And now ICMR has said that we continue it till the pandemic goes on. And we have ICMR observational data which is published also, and it has shown that healthcare workers who are on HCQ prophylaxis, of course, along with wearing PPE, from 4th week onwards, had much better protection as against those who did not take it. So I would say that healthcare workers should definitely take HCQ prophylaxis. I believe in it.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So we have little confusion regarding this prophylaxis, but I think those who get exposed should take it. Dr. Sajan, would you like to add to it?
Yeah, because with the due respect to Dr. Nini, she was advocating in our CCA discussion from the day one on HCQ. Of course, HCQ was a wonderful drug, and we do not know why in an Indian setting, even now the COVID is less invasive when compared to many developed countries. But with the Lancet study and also Solidarity trial, now we are really confused. And they recommend 7 weeks prophylaxis, and Ashik rightly said from 4th week onwards we have definitely improvement and also protection they are giving. But the issue is that how long? See, you are a healthcare worker and you are continued exposed with these patients, and you do not know how long you will be continued, whether 3 months, 6 months, or 1 year. We do not know at this point of time. So how long we should take? That is another issue. So and also HCQ prophylaxis should not be replaced by our universal precautions, social distancing, masking, personal protective equipment, etc., etc. And I have a concern, though I'm not against HCQ, but I have a concern. If you take HCQ, you have a false sense of security, and that should be avoided. Whatever available drugs or whatever mode you take, you have to be very careful in dealing with the patients, because though corona is mortality is 2 to 3%, but still it's going like anything. Many healthcare in European countries, healthcare workers are primarily affected. Not only healthcare workers, the doctors are affected more. So we have to be very careful. And I am I'm not advocating, not against, but it is an individual decision. Actually, in our institution, even for our mild cases, we do not give HCQ. And prophylaxis, none of the people in the front line is taking HCQ. But I'm not equating this with Mumbai. I cannot equate Kerala and Mumbai.
Point very well. I would just like to add on to this that we all have to understand that we have to be wearing adequate PPEs. We have to be wearing proper mask, social distancing. All that is 99.9999%. Whatever 0.001 advantage it could be there, we don't know. So some people believe, some people don't. But personal protection is number one, whether you take HCQ prophylaxis or not.
Okay, thank you. Again, we know that we have many investigation modalities. So one nice question has been asked by Dr. Ganesh Pratap from Karnataka. he has asked what is the gold standard test to be considered for diagnosis of COVID. So if we have so many options, but what should be the gold standard? Uh, I request.
The conventional RT-PCR is a gold
As
standard.
of now,
Because
no
for
doubt, no
molecular.
doubt.
But otherwise, HRCT is also extremely sensitive. So the thing is that basically it's important to have confirmed diagnosis, then RT-PCR is the best gold standard. But if it's coming negative, then HRCT is almost 99% sensitivity in diagnosing COVID. Of course, other conditions also could have similar presentation. So a clinico-radiological correlation would be ideal.
Here also
Okay,
we cannot say for sure that gold standard. Gold standard, no doubt, it is RT-PCR. But the issue with the RT-PCR already we mentioned because time consuming, availability is issue. See, even in Kerala, it took around 1 week many a time to get the results. So we have to sort out a possible alternative to the gold standard. That is also important. Maybe a silver standard or a bronze standard we have to, because our patient load is so high. So assisted HRCT, even antibody tests, and many tests and clinical correlation, all are important, because gold standard not always gold standard, because the time lag is so high with the increasing number of patients across India.
yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So we can conclude that RT-PCR is a gold standard, at least till whatever the information we have. Before going to further, just I like to have a short opinion from our experts that. Is there any difference between clinical presentation or in the way of evaluation in an Indian patient compared to an in a Western world patient from the Western countries?
Okay, I basically feel that I have found fever to be less commonly present in Indian patients as compared to what has been, written about in the Western literature. So we kind of very often find that people don't have fever, or fever is only there for 1 or 2 days, 99, 100, not really high fever. So I basically feel that in Indians, I have found fever to be less prominent. We have found headache is a very, very important sign. I mean, invariably, every patient is really presenting with headache. And we are finding cough and cold in practically everybody.
Our patients also around 20 to 30% of the fever. Headache is very common. And myalgia, people used to say all the patients, severe pain over the body that they are saying. And the thing is that it is not responding to paracetamol. That is also very antipyretic is not responding to paracetamol. That is also we have seen. Then we are seeing mild cases more often, I think. Mild cases. At least in our setup, we are seeing mild cases, not that much serious. I don't know why, maybe due to the polio vaccine or and BCG vaccine, anything, or our herd immunity, or what, or maybe our non-specific immunity. I don't know. But we are seeing mild cases compared to the West, I think.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. So we can conclude that in Indian population, we have a fever is less common and headache is more common compared to the Western population. So we have to be careful when we deal with a patient who don't have fever, because we may end up with an atypical presentation, and we may not evaluate the patient for. So again, before going further, I got a good announcement. Dr. N.S. Krishna sir has announced that looking into the interaction and interest of the participant, 30 minutes has been extended. So we will have a total session of 1.5 hours. Let's moving in further. So one interesting question on radiology. This is from Dr. Balaraju from this Visakhapatnam. He has a query on CT finding in asymptomatic COVID patients. So we can discuss the imaging finding in COVID-19 patient. So what are the outcome and when we should go for actually for imaging finding, because if you ask for imaging again, we are going to expose our radiology unit to it. So we have to be very careful doing all type of imaging. So Dr. Nene, kindly put some light on it.
Yeah, so excellent question by our dear friend Dr. Bala from Vizag. So the thing is that HRCT is important because it has been found that up to 55% of asymptomatic carriers could actually have abnormal HRCT chest. So basically HRCT is very, very important because patients don't have symptoms, but they have abnormal HRCT, and we know that asymptomatic patients are also infectious. So this is a huge thing. But at the same time, we need to understand that a negative HRCT does not rule out COVID, because patient has to have a pneumonia before the HRCT will become abnormal. So very often you can have people only with upper respiratory tract involvement, no lung involvement, and therefore normal HRCT. So the thing is, 55% asymptomatic carriers could have abnormal HRCT, and this becomes an important point for patients who need to undergo surgery. Because I kind of feel that even when RT-PCR comes negative, if the HRCT shows a typical appearance, then we have to actually decide whether the patient needs to undergo surgery or not, because it's not only for our protection, it's also for patients' protection, because we know that patients who are COVID positive have a high chance of mortality and morbidity. And if at all it's an emergency surgery, then we have to decide what kind of anesthesia to use, because patients who undergo GA have a higher chance of mortality, morbidity. So this is a very important part of HRCT. Coming to the typical patterns, then we all know bilateral, subpleural, peripheral, ground glass consolidations. Very often we get the atoll sign, which is a reverse halo sign. And we basically, the consolidations and the ground glass and the subpleural opacities, bilateral, these are the common ones, where we see the HRCT findings. And if at all we were to do CT pulmonary angio, then sometimes there could be peripheral thromboembolism seen, and pulmonary artery might be enlarged.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. We have some classical presentation of viral infection on radiology. So whenever we do, even in asymptomatic patient, it may be positive. So we have to then proceed for further testing. Then another interesting clinical question has come from Dr. Manan Jadliwala. The question is to Dr. Shahjahan sir. So now we can see that there is a seasonal changes are there and many viral infections are on the go. So how to differentiate COVID-19 from other common respiratory infection? Because particularly in areas, particularly in my places also, we have a very high incidence of common cold and other asthma problem compared to part of the rest of the country. So again, within our country we have a variation in our environment and other things. So again. So we have a seasonal flus are also there and other diseases are there. So Dr. Shahjahan, sir, how we do explain this, or how we have to approach this kind of patient in this current scenario?
It seems to be a simple question, but it is extremely difficult question. The coronavirus is a family of viruses causing common cold, many diseases. So, to differentiate this from our COVID-19 from the traditional common cold, other respiratory infections is extremely difficult. All the symptoms we already mentioned, like running nose, nasal stuffiness, fever, headache, etc., are common to both. So, but recently, two symptoms, that is, one is the distaste and loss of taste and inability to identify the odor, is somewhat specific to COVID. But remember, in many of the common cold also this can happen. So the only way is to suspect. Suppose a respiratory symptomatic coming to us during this era, suspect him as a COVID suspect unless proved otherwise. I don't have any evidence to say that a particular symptom is, except for this loss of taste and loss of smell, is somewhat specific to COVID. All others are common actually. I don't have any evidence to say some special symptoms or signs to suggest that this is COVID, this is not COVID.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Nene, would you like to add your experience to it?
Yeah, so I totally agree with Dr. Shahjahan, because the thing is that the symptoms of COVID are just like symptoms of other viral infections. Actually, fortunately, 2 months back, we did not have many viral infections. But now that the rains have come in, the season of all the seasonal flu has also started. So when the patient has viral presentation, always get the COVID test done. Even if the test is coming negative, then also you basically treat the patient, you quarantine him, and you just make sure that social distancing, everything is maintained. And I would definitely do a second or third swab, because we don't really have a problem about sending swabs. We have private labs also allowed. So the thing is, that keep on making an effort to confirm your diagnosis, because that will help you.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So again, we have some interesting questions regarding quarantine and other thing. One question has been put forward by Dr. Stuti Gupta from Delhi, how to manage home quarantine, and similar question by Dr. Soumya from Hyderabad. She has asked specifically Dr. Nene that do we need to advise admission for a patient who are happy hypoxia, so where patient has a SpO2 just less than 88 and but asymptomatic. So, ma'am, you can explain, I think, in detail regarding quarantine and when a positive patient can be home quarantine or when we have to hospitalize the patient.
Okay, so very, very important question by Dr. Suti. And the second question was by who? The happy hypoxia? Okay.
Yeah, second question, do we need to advise admission for a patient with happy hypoxia who is asymptomatic?
Okay, fine. So basically the thing is that first I will answer the happy hypoxia question. So the thing is that we divide our COVID as mild, moderate, severe. So the thing is that if patient saturation is 95 or more, and the patient does not have a pneumonia on a chest X-ray, we call them mild. So these are the patients, if they do not have any comorbidities, like, the age more than 65, hypertension, diabetes, IHT, coexisting lung or renal problems, immunosuppressed, HIV. So the mild patients with no comorbidities will be treated at home. But a patient whose saturation is less than 95, okay, then that person needs to be definitely going to a dedicated COVID care center, where specialists are available. So this is very, very important to know that that is number one about who needs to be admitted. And the second thing is about happy hypoxia. So basically anything more than 95 is abnormal. So 88 becomes grossly abnormal. In fact, anybody whose saturation is less than 90, we take them as severe COVID patient. So these moderate and severe have to be admitted. Anybody whose saturation is less than 94, it would be ideal to admit them because they may suddenly go down. And what is really important is now pulse oximeter. Now practically pulse oximeter has become part and parcel of every patient who is COVID, because it really tells you that how you are really faring. So that was about happy hypoxia admission. And the second thing was about quarantine. So the thing is that about patients who are mildly symptomatic, whose saturation is more than 95, who don't have a pneumonia and who don't have comorbidities can be actually treated at home, provided they have a place. They can be in a single bathroom. Single room with a using a bathroom which is not shared by other people. So these patients can be monitored at home, but of course a pulse oximeter is required to be there, and you tell them to keep on checking their saturation. If it goes less than 95, then inform. If at all they start feeling breathless or there is chest constriction which keeps on continuing, or if the fever is persistent and high, then also you tell them that please come into the hospital. And about the period of quarantine, it's a little controversial because now more and more evidence is coming that from the 10th day of onset of symptom, though the swab may be positive, you are unlikely to be spreading infection. But I'm more of old school thought, and I feel that precaution is better than cure. So my patients of COVID, from the day of symptoms, I advise them at least 2 weeks of quarantine and sometimes even 3 weeks.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So I think audience has got a clear idea from our answer. Now again, some related question. Again, since you have a lot of interest in RT-PCR, again, one interesting question has been put forward by Dr. Tridip Chatterjee from Mumbai. Why are we not doing GeneXpert with cycle threshold value rather than RT-PCR?
Yeah, so actually the thing is that very good question by Dr. Tridip, who is so academically interested every time and comes up with great questions. So the advantage of RT-PCR is that it detects 3 genes, as against GeneXpert, which detects only 2 genes. So technically speaking, RT-PCR, the conventional one, is still superior. So GeneXpert and TrueNAT, which are the faster RT-PCRs, they are only for ruling out COVID when patient needs to undergo surgery. But when we physicians want to treat, we want to give the patient the doubt or the benefit of doubt that it could be having the 3rd gene which may not be detected by, because you need to always detect 2 genes to diagnose COVID. So the GeneXpert and TrueNAT detect only 2 genes, whereas RT-PCR detects 3 genes. So you have a higher chance of coming positive because you have to detect 2 genes for every patient. And therefore cycle threshold is not important. The conventional RT-PCR scores over here because it detects 3 genes.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So, thank you for nicely explaining the things. Then again, we have lots of question regarding management part. The audience are very key relating to different means. So, we'll take the question one by one. Again, already I think some people have already also asked quarantine period. Dr. Stuti Gupta, quarantine period for mild, moderate, and severe disease, and quarantine when someone who was detected on contact tracing and so to further manage. We proceed to the management of COVID-19. In short, I would like to ask Dr. Sagan regarding how will you define mild, moderate, and severe COVID, and what are the quarantine strategies for this group of patients?
First of all, we have mild, moderate, and severe and critical cases. Maybe we can categorize into four. And second part is the quarantine part. The quarantine part is not actually related to the severity actually. We are doing quarantine, actually room quarantine, not home quarantine, room quarantine for those who are apparently having no disease or suspected to harbor the virus. So what we do is that we are making them quarantine, socially isolating, giving them food in a special room. You are keeping some 6 feet distance. Many of our colleagues are doing quarantine. Their partners are giving food at a distance, some 6 meter. Even them, though we say 6 feet, somebody is at a distance of 6 meters. That's a different issue. So, and the timing also is the government and the policymakers are changing as the evidence is pouring in. Somebody 14. In our that we used to have usually 14, and at times in selective cases it is 21 asymptomatic cases. And now the second part you are saying is mild, moderate, severe, and critical. Mild mean actually patient is actually we should have a non-mild actually no symptoms. Some 62% of the cases have no symptoms. Patient have no symptoms, absolutely no symptoms. They are harboring virus. Okay, leave that group alone and consider mild. Mild means upper respiratory running nose, maybe having some malaise, some fever or a slight rising temperature like that. Nothing like that. Your X-ray is normal. Everything is normal. If you take a blood sample, you may have some lymphopenia or total leukocyte count may be less or neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio may be high, such that very few evidence. Then moderate. Moderate means you may have some, apart from all these symptoms, you may have some chest infiltrates. As in the HRCT, may have some bilateral ill-defined infiltrates that is peripherally bound, all these things. And some cases, another case is some 10 to around 10% of the cases have severe disease with bilateral solid consolidation with hypoxia, desaturation, all these things, and the patient needs either high flow oxygen or even NAV. NAV is controversial with the negative pressure ventilation we have to give. And another group, some 4 to 5%, really critical. They need invasive mechanical ventilation and all the sorts of medications becoming medicated tocilizumab, rabarbopinavir, many drugs. So these are the criteria. But remember, as high as 80 to 85% of the patients are in the mild group till now, and around 5 to 7% moderate, maybe severe patients somewhere around 5, and critical patients around 4 to 5%.
I agree completely with Dr. Shahjahan. I'd just like to add 2-3 points which will be clinically more useful to our friends. So mild means no pneumonia on X-ray, and your saturation is 95 and more, and you don't have any respiratory distress. Moderate is that you have a pneumonia without respiratory distress, and your saturation is between 90 to 94 on COVID. And severe is you have pneumonia along with respiratory. So in moderate, your RR is more than 24. In mild, your RR is less than 24. In moderate, the RR is more than 24. And in severe, you have pneumonia with respiratory distress. So your RR will be more than 30 and your saturation will be less than 90. And you require additional respiratory support, whereby additional oxygen or NIV or HFNC or non-breathing mask or ventilation. So this is how we like to clinically say mild, moderate, severe, because our treatment basically is guided by the presentation when the patient comes to us, the severity of presentation?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sajan, Dr. Nini. So we now have come to an idea that how the COVID will have, how our type of presentation will have, what atypical presentation may be there, and we have now already discussed how we have a different scenario in the Indian subcontinent. And we also have discussed regarding the different diagnostic modalities, including imaging. So now we move on to the management part. So I would like to request Dr. Nene. This question regarding management has been asked by the several audience. So the question is how we can do a stepwise management of different mild, moderate, and severe patient. After discussing this question, we'll discuss many specific points regarding management in details. Dr. Nene, kindly give your opinion.
Right. So very interesting and very useful question. And so the thing is, if the patient is mild, that means the patient does not have pneumonia, just has some respiratory symptoms, saturation is 95 and more, and RR is less than 24. So in these patients, especially if they have a comorbidity, then we must give hydroxychloroquine. We just need on a dose 400 VD on the first day, and then we give 200 VD for the next 4 days. In addition to hydroxychloroquine, basically I prefer to give vitamin C. We give 1000 per day, and we give zinc 100 milligrams a day. I also like to give vitamin D supplementation to the patient. Best to get vitamin D levels and then correct accordingly. Otherwise, there's no harm in just giving 60,000 units once a week for 4 weeks. So this is something that I like to do for all my patients for treatment of mild disease. Also, it's important that we, for so looking mild disease also, it would be good to do a 6-minute walk test, because if at all they are desaturating by more than 2%, then though clinically they are fitting into mild, I would be more tempted to treat them as moderate. And in moderate, in addition to giving HCQ, the zinc, the vitamin D and vitamin C, what we basically want to do is that we want to start awake proning for these patients, which is very, very important, because it has been found that awake proning basically helps increase the saturation. And at the same time, we'd like to give low molecular weight heparin in addition to patients who have moderate presentation. And we want to give them additional oxygen to keep their saturation between 90 to 96% in normal patients. But patients who are COPD, we want to give additional oxygen to keep saturation between 88 to 92%. So patients who are moderate, we like to give them HCQ, zinc, vitamin C, vitamin D. We like to give them awake proning. We like to give them low molecular weight heparin, usually prefer Clexane in OD dose. And also we like to give oxygen to maintain the saturation between 92 to 96%. That is about moderate. And for patients who are severe, the role of HCQ is little not really proven, but I prefer to give HCQ in these patients regardless, provided we don't have the contraindications, so no QT prolongation, no myocarditis because of the severe disease. And as a rule, I prefer to get the G6PD done for every patient I give HCQ to. And I always check serum potassium, the corrected calcium and magnesium, just like we do for our bedaquiline patients, because these abnormalities lead to QT prolongation. And very often just correcting this has actually made a prolonged QT normal, and then we comfortably given HCQ. So this was the HCQ thing for every kind of a patient, mild, moderate, or severe. So patients who are severe, they require more oxygen. So often they require non-breathing mask to give 100% oxygen. If doesn't help, then we give HFNC or NIV, and otherwise we may need to intubate the patient. Over and above, we like to give steroids also. So moderate patients also, you can give steroids in the dose of 0.5 to 1 mg per kg for about 3 to 5 days. But in severe patients, we give higher doses, 1 to 2 mg per kg for 5 to 7 days. And we like to give low molecular weight heparin in the BD dose. And at the same time, proning always continues for these patients. And and additional thing, if the patient has any hypotension, then you want to initially give fluids, and if the fluids don't help, then you may have to start inotropes. And if the patient has any evidence of secondary infection, then you'd like to give antibiotics for these patients.
Okay.
Other drugs, like I think you'll probably ask me about tocilizumab, etc. We'll cover probably when asked.
We have a question regarding different drugs as well. Again, one very interesting question has been asked by Dr. N.S. Krishna sir, will since the disease is spreading everywhere, in spite of the best management or from the doctors or very excellent care or by the government or, and all the healthcare workers, still the disease is spreading everywhere. So will our herd immunity will going to help us in long run? So Dr. Shahjahan, kindly put your inputs in regarding herd immunity in COVID-19.
Would you please kind enough to repeat the question? I didn't hear actually. Maybe would you please repeat the question? Would you
Yes,
please
sir.
kind enough to repeat?
Yes, sir. Sure. Because of the this, in spite of our treatment care, COVID is spreading everywhere. So, is there what is your opinion regarding herd immunity on COVID-19?
See, the herd immunity was being described by the UK people for long. Actually, see, we should realize what it is actually herd immunity. Herd immunity means either we should have a vaccine with us or we should have natural immunity. For to get natural immunity, at least 70, that is the magic number. 70% of the population has to be infected. You just remember Kerala. Kerala is a country, is a state where 3 crore people are living, at least 3 crore people. That means at least 2.1 crore people of Kerala have to be infected with the COVID to get herd immunity for we all people. So what is the mortality rate of COVID at present? You can take Kerala, with a lot of elder persons, but let it be 2%. You consider it at 2%. So that means 2.1 crore into 2%, that means more than 4 lakh people. We have to sacrifice more than 4 lakh people in Kerala alone to get herd immunity. So herd immunity is out of question right now, unless you have a vaccine. Suppose you get a vaccine, you vaccinate all the people and the vaccine protection is more than 80%, it is well and good. Otherwise, by natural immunity, we are hoping for herd immunity means disastrous. Second thing, even the death rate is only more than 4 lakh, maybe around 4 to 5 lakhs. Not only that, 5% will be critically ill. You need to have ventilator, you need to have many drugs, you need to have healthcare workers support. It's absolutely impossible. So let us pray that the concept we should have a vaccine first at the earliest. We should get a good medication first, and let this virus be attenuated. Let it shed off its virulence at the earliest. We can pray for that. Herd immunity is not at all an option, not at all a absolutely we will be danger. So we just take it in Kerala, maybe around 4 to 5 lakhs. That we just calculate in India. We cannot.
I totally agree with Dr. Shahjahan, and I'd like to do the Indian calculation. So currently, assuming that the Indian population is 135 crores, and also taking the infectivity rate of COVID is 2.8, we require 65% Indians to be infected. Okay, and assuming that 5% of infected people will actually die, 4 crore Indians will have to die before we get herd immunity. This is too big a price to pay. So we better look after them ourselves. We better wear masks, better maintain social distancing, and we don't want to get herd immunity. We just want to be careful.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nina, Dr. Shahjahan. So we have to move on quickly into some very specific question regarding treatment management. One interesting question has been put forward by Dr. Kalpesh Gandhi from Jalgaon. Do all symptomatic patients need anticoagulant even if D-dimer is normal? Again, similar question from Dr. Suti from Delhi. Anticoagulation in mild cases would require home isolation only. So we can discuss regarding anticoagulation and different aspects related to this in COVID-19. So Dr. Nina, kindly put your idea about anticoagulant.
Okay, so basically, I kind of feel that it's very, very important that we get a D-dimer done in every patient, whether he's mild, moderate, or severe. Because the thing is that very often you may be mild, but you could go to moderate because when the inflammation is on. So if at all your symptoms are mild, your saturation is more than 95%, your RR is less than 24, your symptoms are mild. But if your D-dimer comes positive, then it's an indirect indicator of inflammation which is going on. And therefore, even with mild symptoms, if the D-dimer is positive, I would like to give prophylaxis of low molecular weight heparin in the OD dose. This is for mild and the moderate patients. But patients who are severe, in them, if the D-dimer is negative, I would still give an OD dose. But if the D-dimer is positive, then I would like to give BD dose of low molecular weight heparin. So this is basically true. So if it's a mild patient with normal D-dimer, I don't give them anticoagulation. If it's a mild patient with a positive D-dimer, I give them prevention of OD dose. If it's a moderate patient with negative D-dimer, I still give them prevention with OD dose. But if it's a moderate patient with positive, I still give them BD dose. And if it's a severe patient, negative D-dimer, you give OD, and if it's positive, you give BD anyways.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Again, yes, Dr. Sajan, would you like to add something?
Yes, I just want to add one thing. As Dr. Ini has beautifully pointed out the issues. Actually, we need to give low molecular weight heparin in almost all the patients. Because many of our patients, asymptomatic patients, already healthy patients, we are losing all of a sudden. Maybe due to happy hypoxia or whatever, we do not know, microthrombin. And also there are reports, especially from Middle East, there are reports of young heart attacks without any comorbidity, without any pre-existing lung disease or heart disease, are dying due to young heart attacks. So this could be due to microthrombin. So can we prevent this by giving low molecular weight heparin? It's an important thing. And we have to give, I think we have to give in each and every COVID proven case, even it is mild, moderate or severe, because COVID-19 is not a respiratory disease alone. It is now a systemic disease. It is a vascular disease nowadays. We know that it is the widespread vasculitis, vasculoplegia, all these are issues. So patient may have devastating effects. So it is better to start on, because it is a safe drug, it is better to start on low molecular weight heparin, I think.
Yeah, and the logic behind what Dr. Shahjahan is saying, but at least in Bombay, we are using something different. So if the patient is mild and the D-dimer is negative, then we are preferring to repeat blood test every 3 to 5 days. And only when the D-dimer is positive, at that time we are giving low molecular weight heparin, because it is as per the guidelines, and we just feel that if the D-dimer is negative and you give LMWH and a patient got some complication, then medical legally it could get related.
That's true. But the thing is that the patient is bedridden on all these things, and we should have
a medical indication. If there's a medical indication, if the patient has even mild COVID, you should like to give. But without medical indication, we are avoiding giving in mild unless D-dimer is raised.
Okay.
Maybe in the mildest forms we can avoid, maybe.
And also what is really important is that we should repeat inflammatory markers every 3 days, because who is normal with negative markers could become positive 3 days later, and therefore your decision to give may change. So that is
regarding this marker, actually Dr. Muralidhar Reddy from Telangana has asked almost the similar question. How frequently we have to send investigations such as D-dimer, CRP, ferritin, ESR or LDH?
Okay, so the thing is that we actually are taking D-dimer, CRP, ferritin as more important markers of inflammation. So what we are basically doing is that if the patient is mild, then we are doing a baseline, and then we are repeating after 3 to 5 days based on how the symptoms are and what the saturation picture is and what the X-ray was showing. That's what we are doing for mild patients. But if the patient is moderate, then we are doing every 48 to 72 hours depending on how. So the patient is stable, we are doing after every 3 days. But if the patient is not stable, oxygen requirement is increasing, the patient is getting progressively breathless, then we are doing every 48 hours. And patients who are severely affected, we are doing practically every day also, or every other day. So it basically depends on the severity of presentation and how well or badly the patient is progressing.
Okay, thank you. So again, we have a very interesting question to Dr. Shahjahan sir. This is from Dr. Sainath from Vijayawada. He has asked regarding tocilizumab indication in patient with COVID-19. What are the indication, and does it require when the IL-6 is normal?
Actually, my experience with the tocilizumab is limited. Only one of our colleagues from Ernakulam used it and said that it is a wonderful result. Actually, we should give it in a very severe condition, and also if the IL-6 is IL-6. Otherwise, I don't have much experience. I think Dr. Nini can add on that. I don't have much experience. From reports from Ernakulam, Cochin, says that one of the patients on doxycycline remarkably improved with the severity as well as they could discharge early, all these things. But otherwise, in our institution, we never had the opportunity to use this particular drug.
Okay, so thanks for passing on this question to me. So basically, the thing is that in Bombay we have IL-6 test available everywhere. So we are not giving tocilizumab unless IL-6 is raised. So as a priority, if IL-6 is normal, then we are not giving tocilizumab, because then you know that the cause of hypoxia could be pulmonary microembolism, etc. So we are giving tocilizumab. We are considering giving it only if the IL-6 is high, and the indications are those patients who are severe, who are basically their oxygen requirement is worsening despite you giving all the standard therapy, including methylprednisolone in the dose of 1 to 2 mg per kg for 3 to 5 days, and at the same time, patients who are on a mechanical ventilation are not getting better. So the thing is that tocilizumab, at least in our use, has to have high IL-6. The oxygen requirement should be increasing despite requiring steroids. And despite being on ventilation, they are not really getting better, whether it's non-invasive or invasive ventilation. So that is one thing. But and of course, we've had excellent results with tocilizumab. But I just want to basically say that we have to be very, very careful, because tocilizumab is definitely an extremely immunocompromising drug. And somehow we are scared of steroids immunocompromised, but we just feel tocilizumab is like a wonder drug. So I just want to tell everybody that tocilizumab somehow it's become a glamorous drug, which it is not. So the thing is that if you have to first start steroids on patients on methylprednisolone, and after giving methylprednisolone, please wait at least ideally for 5 days, or otherwise at least for 3 days before you decide to give the patient tocilizumab. Because the thing is that if you give it earlier and the patient responds to tocilizumab, actually it could be the steroid which was actually working. So not only is tocilizumab expensive, but the problem is that it's terribly immunocompromising. And in a country like India, where there is TB, which is so rampant, you're predisposing the patient to get TB, and it can also give rise to tumors in the future. So please be very careful, because it should not be that I gave tocilizumab, so wow. It's like, not just immediate result, but even long-term result is very important. And very often our patients after tocilizumab are getting secondary infections. So please change your lines. If the lines are 7 days old, please make sure the lines are changed. Please make sure that you rule out active infection. Do your Procal. Keep on doing it from time to time. If the patient is infected, give a good antibiotic cover, and then give tocilizumab, because patients responding to tocilizumab on the 5th or 7th day may go down because of secondary infection.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Since we are running short of time, we have just another 25 minutes left. So we'll try to take some specific question from the audience. So again, I think people are also very much interested on favipiravir. So again, there are two questions related to it. Role of favipiravir from Dr. Namrata from Mumbai, and this opinion, experience and indication of favipiravir by Dr. Ganesh Pratap from Bengaluru. And also we have again similar question regarding this favipiravir. Is the favipiravir to all mild COPD patients? This is from Dr. Balaraju from Visakhapatnam. So we can, I think, in short discuss this favipiravir here. And also we have again one question from Dr. Pradeep Chatterjee again. What is the exact Indian experience of favipiravir? So I think Dr. Nini would like to take this question.
Thank you for giving this question to me, because I was on the advisory board, so I've done a lot of research and a lot of reading on favipiravir. So I'm happy to share whatever literature I've gone through. So basically the thing is that favipiravir is a drug which has been available for many years. It is an antiviral drug, and it has
interrupt again just one more question to it also. Dr. Ravi from Indore has asked specifically to Dr. Nene, will remdesivir and favipiravir be the end of corona epidemic? So ma'am, kindly proceed with.
Okay, whatever questions I remember, I'm going to answer them. So as I said, it's a drug which is available for many years to us. It's an antiviral drug, and it's basically got antiviral effect against many RNA viruses also. We know that COVID-19 is caused by an RNA virus. What basically it does is it inhibits the RDRP gene. which is in fact the diagnostic gene required in the diagnosis of COVID. So the thing is that this is a drug which actually prevents replication of virus. This is the mechanism by which it acts. So the thing is that there are a number of studies which are available, but the largest data we have is from Japan, where 2,100 patients were given favipiravir on a compassionate basis. So all the patients who were admitted in the hospital, they had either mild, moderate or severe COVID, and they found that patients who had mild COVID who received favipiravir, 88% recovered, and patients who were moderate, 85% recovered at the end of 14 days. In severe patients, the recovery was seen in only 60% of patients. So you may want to say that mild patients anyways would have recovered or whatever, but 88% was there. And even in moderate patients, there was recovery of 85%. So I kind of feel it's quite promising. So mild and moderate favipiravir would definitely be good. In severe, of course, we know that whenever we start medicines late, we are not really sure if it will work, because more than the virus, it's the inflammation which ends up being harmful to the patient. So this is about the favipiravir, the advantages, etc. Two things I want to just mention is that we need to know that in females who are pregnant, basically there are studies which have shown that it could be teratogenic in animals, and therefore in pregnancy it has not been used, and also in lactating mothers. But in our government is basically given this thing that a pregnant mother can be actually given a choice, that favipiravir has not been used in humans, and it is probably teratogenic, but she's still to be given a choice whether she wants to take it or not. So pregnancy, you have to be careful. That is about favipiravir. Otherwise, it's a well-tolerated drug. The side effects are increase in uric acid, a little bit of LFT, SGOT, HPT going up, and a little bit of nausea, vomiting. Otherwise, it's a well-tolerated drug. I don't know if there were any more questions asked. I'm confused. Any more questions were asked about favipiravir? Do I need to answer any more about it?
Okay, I think almost the query regarding favipiravir.
One thing I just want to clarify about favipiravir, which I have been reading on different WhatsApp groups, I just want to say this, that the expiry period is 3 months. So everybody's thinking that, how can you be using this drug, etc. So I just want to clarify that every favipiravir drug has been given expiry of 3 months, because that is because in India, the trials of favipiravir have been going on only for 3 months. So Indian company produced favipiravir from the synthesis date has stability of 3 months. That has been proven, and therefore the permission has been granted for 3 months. As we get more and more data of stability of the drug lasting for a longer period, this permission will be increased, because lots of WhatsApp groups were actually putting up something like that. And the second thing was that because the patient has to take permission, people were saying that are the patients a part of the trial, etc. So basically there was a trial in India conducted at 10 places, and 150 patients were involved, so 140 had already been enrolled, only 2 are remaining. So whichever patients are taking favipiravir or will be taking, because it will be introduced from tomorrow, they will not be a part of the trial, but they need to give a consent, because they need to say that we know that this drug has been accepted on an emergency basis, and therefore this consent has to be taken. These are the two things which a lot of people keep on asking us on WhatsApp groups. So
thank you, ma'am.
Another issue with favipiravir, the question is, will it at the end of the corona? It's very unlikely and too premature to answer. Actually, the 2-drug combination therapy was the phase study also showed that not that much significant improvement actually. Phase study one is Umi-Efinavar. It prevents the attachment of the corona to the cells, and also actually, Dr. Nini said our favipiravir, what is it used is replication, to prevent the replication. But both these drugs together even don't have much improvement. The only thing we have to there, we will have more and more drugs. We hope we will get a good result, but that is not the end of corona. Our deeds are more important. That has to be not to be forgotten.
I think end of corona is only marked by a very effective vaccine, where you do mass vaccination
only
the entire
vaccine.
population. Otherwise, drugs will only help treatment and probably will improve the outcome, effective drugs. But it can probably end. In fact, yes, Dr. Ravi, our dear friend Dr. Ravi Dosi from Indore had asked this question. So the thing is, the vaccinations will actually end the corona times. The drugs will only make the outcome better. But of course, the drugs need to kind of still prove their effectivity. We are kind of hopeful, but it still needs to withstand the testing by the trials.
And also over a period of time, the virus will attenuate itself. Its virulence decrease over a period of time, and will be all safe.
Thank you. I have to move ahead. Actually, we'll take a quick question on two quick question on management aspect. Then we'll move up to management of COPD and COVID-19 and ILD other things in a short. And also we'll take some question on how to do
Dr. Krish,
international
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to say two more things about favipiravir. One is the pill count, that you need to take like 18 drugs on the
Yes.
first day, and you need to take,
Yes.
the thing is that, but what I basically want to say that it's actually a blessing in disguise, because the thing is that because the pills are just so many, people will not just start, 18 drugs on the first day and 8 drugs on remaining 13 days. So people will not just start popping in drugs left, right, and center. So that is one advantage. And the second thing is about the cost. The therapy is expensive. It's about 12 to 13,000 rupees, counting the entire cost of 14 days. So it is good and bad. The good part is that people who are mild, means GPs will not prescribe it to everybody. And the other thing is that if you consider, a patient going bad and getting hospitalized, then the cost of therapy just at home with favipiravir turns out to be cheaper than the cost of hospitalization. So I think that the high pill count actually makes it little less commonly prescribed by GPs, which is actually, I think, that a big advantage, where we chest physicians or doctors who are, COVID care specialists, they will decide if the drug is really required, unlike HCQ and ivermectin doxy, which is getting prescribed left, right, and center.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, ma'am.
And my
So
other thing I just forgot to say was about treatment of COVID. So this is like my personal experience, in my opinion. This is not recommended anywhere, but I am basically giving HCQ along with ivermectin doxy in all my COVID patients. So the thing is that though ivermectin doxy has not been officially recommended by ICMR, the drug is safe, does not have any side effects, and I kind of feel that if the drug is safe, then more you do, better it is for the patient. So this is not recommended. This is my practice, whether right or wrong. But my patients of HCQ, my patients of COVID, I'm giving them on the first day when the swab comes positive. I'm giving ivermectin doxy, and I'm sending the G6PD, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And once it comes normal, on the second day, I'm starting HCQ. That's what I'm doing. I don't know if it's justified or not. I'm doing it, and I'm honestly accepting it.
okay, thank you, ma'am. So we just take one quick question on from Dr. Naveen Kumar from Andhra Pradesh. He has asked, what is the time when we should start steroid as an anti-inflammatory agent in COVID-19? So Dr. Sajan, kindly give a quick answer to this question.
Actually, steroid comes as a wonder. Recovery trial comes as a wonder. Because with the beginning, we chest physicians across the countries arguing for steroids. In our center, state board, we are asking them to start on steroid. They were even opposing the use of inhaled steroids in asthma. That was a situation in the earlier phase of Kerala State Medical Board. But now people realize that it is the wonderful drug which can be used. So in our center, we are using it from moderate to severe cases. In moderate cases, when you have seen HRCT or X-ray findings suggestive of pneumonia, they say there is interstitial infiltrates. Interstitial infiltrates mean there is an issue with the gas transfer. So the only available, the best anti-inflammatory agent available is steroids. What we used to give is that we used to give around some 1 milligram per kilogram body weight of methotrexate, that is around 40 milligram BD. To patients with moderate to severe cases, and really we do not have to across a very severe patient, so I don't have experience, but all the moderate cases we used to give steroids, and I think we can reduce the need for high flow oxygenation, reduce the need for NAV, and possibly reduce the need for intubation. And we have to be cautious. We have to be cautious. Don't give steroids to all. Don't give all suspects. All patients are starting eating dexamethasone. That should not happen. We should be cautious, and we have to give. If we want to give steroid in the right dose at the right time. That is most important.
Yes, I quite agree with you. And actually, in Mumbai, we are getting very, very sick patients. So I'd like to basically say that when patients who are moderate come to us, that means saturation between 90 to 94, or a pneumonia, or RR more than 24, then we are not straight away starting steroids. Actually, we are basically starting the patients on HCQ. Based on the D-dimer, we are deciding about the LMWH. We are starting awake pronate. Despite doing all this, if the patients are not responding, then if it's moderate cases, we are starting steroids with prednisolone 0.5 to 1 mg per kg for 3 to 5 days. This is what we are doing for moderate patients. And if patients are severe, So in these patients, if the saturation is less than 90%, if they require extra oxygen, RR is more than 30, there's respiratory distress. In these patients, we are giving steroids 1 to 2 mg per kg for 5 to 7 days, and sometimes it ends up becoming more than 7 days also. We are trying to limit it to maximum 2 weeks, but that's what we are doing.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So we have a definite role of steroid in COVID-19, but there's indications are very specific. We have to follow the guidelines and the experience as well. So already we have discussed almost different aspect of COVID-19.
I'd like to add one thing. How the recovery trial dexamethasone is just making headlines everywhere.
Yes.
But I can feel that we Indians are not exactly impressed with it, because we have been using methylprednisolone from the start. We've been having good results, and therefore I will be a little hesitant to really change over to dexamethasone, because I'm happy we got good results and good experience with methylprednisolone.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, ma'am. So again, we have touched almost every aspect of COVID management, different drug strategies. Just one final things I think we should discuss is your plasma therapy. I request Dr. Nene to give your experience and opinion regarding your plasma therapy and what will be the future of plasma therapy in COVID-19 management.
Okay, so the thing is that actually we have just very recently got permission to give plasma therapy in our hospital. So all this time we did not have permission, and therefore honestly speaking, I have not used plasma therapy in any of my patients. So whatever I'm going to say is like what I have heard from my colleagues and what I have really read about it. So plasma therapy as of now is still an experimental therapy, like not officially recommended. Like we give tocilizumab, you may decide to give plasma. But what we need to basically understand is that patients should be severe COVID. And ideally, I would consider it only after methylprednisolone, tocilizumab have failed. I would not use plasma therapy before that. And what we need to know is that the patients, it has to be ABO compatibility. The blood group has to be matching. That is number one. And at the same time, you have to meet the titers of the donor, which has to be more than 1:640 times. These two things are important, and reactions could occur. So you need to monitor the patient also for several hours after that, because some of my colleagues have actually lost patients a few hours after plasma therapy was given because of cross reactions. And the patient should not be IgA deficient and should not be having any immunoglobulin hypersensitivity. And you have to give the plasma therapy over maximum 2 hours. You can't give it over longer period, because otherwise there could be higher complications. So honestly, I've not used plasma therapy. So
even the JAMA editorial clearly states that it has no benefit. This study is only from the positive results only from Wuhan, China. No other center is giving a good result actually. And Indian results are also only anecdotal reports. People are using here and there only. There is no evidence actually. So we have to be skeptical, because we have other options, better options available. Now we have steroids, now we have other drugs. So plasma therapy, convalescent serum, having antibodies, whether these antibodies are protective or not know. So it is at this point of time, we cannot recommend plasma therapy as a routine. In selective cases, in some cases it may be possible, but the evidence is against at present. Even the JAMA 12th June editorial also said it is no benefit actually.
Yeah, I agree. Somehow I have my reservations against plasma therapy. I would like to keep it as the very last option.
Yeah, the last option.
When we got permission to use it in our hospital, I wasn't in particular excited, because I really couldn't see myself use it.
Yeah. I request the speaker to give a short comment. The question from Dr. Sagar from Nasik. He has asked some comment on ivermectin.
So basically the thing is that we have results from Bangladesh, so still nothing is really published, but thanks to all this, basically thanks to media, we have basically results from Bangladesh where they have given ivermectin 12 grams, so they say there are different, some people have used for 1 day, some for 3 days, some for 5 days along with doxy, and they've got very good conversion. So I'm actually not using ivermectin doxy as a drug of choice, first drug of choice. I'm preferring to give HCQ along with ivermectin doxy, and only those patients where HCQ is contraindicated, I'm giving them ivermectin doxy. That is what I'm doing. But according to me, it's a drug with no side effects. I would be happy to continue prescribing for everybody.
Yeah, okay, thank you, ma'am. So again, we just have discussed almost every issues, but again, we have to discuss two interesting point regarding COVID-19 is the interventional pulmonology or the bronchoscopies that we are doing. So again, a related question by Dr. Mohan from Bangalore has asked this question that what the precautions or we should take, and actually should we avoid bronchoscopy, or when we should do actually bronchoscopy in this current pandemic situation. Dr. Shahjahan and Dr. Ninek, you can give your quick inputs into these queries.
There are two issues in that. One is our routine bronchoscopy for non-COVID cases. Second case, I think you may have to do cases for COVID suspects or COVID proven cases. So considering non-COVID cases, many cases are pending nowadays because of the aerosol generating issues. Many centers are not doing. And such indication, first of all, we should have it is better we should have a COVID test prior to the bronchoscopy. And now our recommendation is that pooled RT-PCR for patients subjected to bronchoscopy, and if any one of them become positive, you have to do RT-PCR for all of this. Again, that is a time-consuming issue.
I would
Then another issue is immediately after that the issue that you have to do bronchoscopy. So the grade 3 protection is called you have to wear mask, N95, facial shield, double mask, gowns, everything including shoes. Grade 3 protection that is available, and I am not going to the details. And second option is you are really in danger when you are going to do a bronchoscopy in a COVID positive patient. Suppose you wanted to take bronchoalveolar, whatever it may be. In such cases, again, you have to have the full precautions. You should have a negative pressure suit. Not only you, all your colleagues, all your supporting staff should have adequate precautions, personal protective equipment, and all the precautions to avoid aerosol generations to the minimum, etc., etc. Grade 3 protection has to be there. But in my personal opinion, it is better to restrict these aerosol generating procedure to the really need patients, because nowadays we used to do bronchoscopy for many conditions, but now you go for other options, like suppose you wanted to get a CT guided FNAC, ultrasound guided FNAC is possible, you better go for that rather than bronchoscopy. But if bronchoscopy is needed, you have to be very careful, you have to be fully conscious, under full protection. That's it.
Okay, I'd like to add a bit more. I'd like to announce that the Indian Association for Bronchology is coming up with Indian guidelines how to conduct bronchoscopy, and it will be published hopefully in less than a month's time. It will be out everywhere. We've already written the document and submitted. So basically, just to quickly say that we know that COVID is going to last here at least for a year. So the thing is, and we as interventional pulmonologists have to do procedures, because in addition to COVID, there are so many conditions. Like we have so much of TB in our country. If the sputum is negative, if the patient can't bring out, or you're suspecting drug resistance, you will have to do bronchoscopy. So the thing is that we have given very good recommendations as to how to do the procedure safely without infecting yourself. So for example, we are saying that RT-PCR is a must, HRCT chest is a must. So you want to rule out possibility of COVID in the patient. If anything is suggestive, then you want to postpone bronchoscopy by at least 4 weeks if possible, because a patient who is symptomatic with COVID has more complications of bronchoscopy. And we have basically said that, a patient, if they have COPD, asthma, then we should avoid giving nebulizations before the bronchoscopy, but please give them MDI through spacer. Even we don't want to give lignocaine nebulization to these patients, because that's again aerosol producing. We've recommended that we use the protection bronchoscopy box placed over the patient so that the exposure becomes less. And we have basically given a very good summary of 20 careful points. You just read on the first page and you know what to do and what not to do so as to protect yourself from bronchoscopy. You also maintain safety of the patient and you prevent chance of getting infected. So very nice, detailed publication has been submitted, and hopefully in a month's time it will be in everybody's hands to read. So I'm proud to say that IIB has come up with a very good document, and the most eminent pulmonologists across India, the bronchoscopists, have contributed to it, and so I'm waiting for this document to come out.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. I think hopefully there are actually we have a different guidelines from different societies like American Association of Bronchologists and other European guidelines are also there. So currently we are limiting our bronchoscopy to a great extent. So we try to depend more on the radiology at this current period. But even if we have to do bronchoscopy, we have to take all the precautions. Even after doing a RT-PCR test, because again their sensitivity specificities are again issues. So again we have to take full precaution, full PPs are required. We have now have only 5 minutes to wrap up our program. Within this 5 minutes, we would like to discuss the effect of COVID-19 on our chronic non-communicable respiratory diseases like asthma, COPD, and ILD. So Dr. Neeraj Gupta from Ajmer and Dr. Mohan from Vijayawada has asked the question regarding what is the impact of this COVID-19 on this chronic respiratory diseases like asthma, COPD, and ILD. So I request Dr. Nene and Dr. Sajan to give 2 to 3 minutes to summarize your experience during this period.
Okay, so I'll just quickly say in 2 minutes that we know that patients with chronic respiratory conditions, whether it's COPD, whether it's asthma, whether it's post-TB bronchitis, post-TB sequelae, they have a higher chance of complications of COVID. So that is number one. But the treatment of these conditions remain the same, whether it's TB, COPD, or asthma. You continue the same treatment. You don't stop anything. You want to continue vaccinations, etc. If the patient is COVID positive, then we avoid giving nebulization to these patients because it becomes more of an aerosol generating procedure. And I want to specifically mention about ILD. In ILD, where we were really all the time saying that you must do a biopsy to prove and all that. So we are just saying that in ILD, the more importance is now going to come to HRCT to diagnose with so much of COVID happening. But of course, if you are belonging to an area which is low prevalence of COVID and HRCT is nothing suggestive and your swabs have come negative, then you could be doing the biopsies. But I kind of feel that patients of ILD, there will be more stress on HRCT for the diagnosis as against tissue diagnosis that we were doing so left, right, and center practically in every patient if required. And a lot of people are saying that TB prevalence will actually come down. I don't exactly agree with this because I feel that in immunocompetent patients, TB is actually reactivation of your old infection. So just by wearing masks currently to patients who are immunocompetent, it need not really come down. But patients who are immunocompromised, who have an equally high chance of getting reinfection TB, their wearing masks is going to reduce the chance of TB.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nene. Dr. Sajan,
yeah. We have to be careful about the non-COVID cases. With the starting of lockdown, what happens is that most of our patients could not come to the hospital due to many reasons, and we have telemedicine options and all these things. And now people, especially the policymakers, because of the reduction of atmospheric pollution, our COPD is decreased, our asthma is decreased, everything is decreased. That is an oversimplification of a process actually. Simply because of the pollution is decreasing over a period of 1 month, how COPD is going to decrease like anything. Personally, I believe many of the patients could not get correct medication in time and they succumb to the eternity, I personally believe. So what we should do is that we should address this issue, non-COVID issue we should address. Actually, COPD patients, they have to take medications as per protocol. Asthma patients, they have to take medication because if they come to the hospitals frequently, what happens? And many patients on ILD patients, collagen vascular ILD patients, they stop the steroids because of the fear of steroids and COVID. And now they realize that the disease is exacerbated. So we, as pulmonologists, we should educate the public, educate the policymakers that these drugs have to be continued. And there are international guidelines. Our GOLD guideline is there, GINA guideline is there, British Thoracic guideline on ILD is there, and also many guidelines are coming out. We have to continue with the medications as per protocols. Otherwise, what happens is that these poor people will come to the hospitals often at odd times, violating all the lockdown norms, and they frequently visit hospitals, and they will have not only COVID, they will have many other secondary infections, and we will be in trouble. So we have to be very careful, and we have to tell this to the public as well as to the policymakers.
Okay, thank you, sir. Again, we are running short of time. I would like to have a final concluding remark, one-line remark from Dr. Nene and Dr. Sajan. We're going to wrap up this wonderful session.
I just want to bring up one. I think actually we have, I think, covered everything. I just want to bring up one thing that very often patients of COVID end up with COVID-related fibrosis, and therefore they often require oxygen at least for some time. We don't know whether it's going to be long term. So I basically want to say that about 20% of our patients are actually being sent home on concentrators, and we are hoping that this will actually turn around. And we are giving them home oxygen. Once they are fine, we are giving them vaccinations. And at the same time, we are insisting that pulmonary rehabilitation and physiotherapy is done correctly. So there is this particular group which we need to be aware about. This is something, the message that I want to give it to. But all our patients have gone off oxygen within 2 to 4 weeks, which is really very, very promising.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Dr. Sajan, your last comment.
just want to tell my colleagues, be cautious, be safe, and contact tracing, social distancing, universal masking is important. Drugs will come, but we have to be careful with the standard precautionary measures, not only to help our patients, but also to help us and also our family and friends. Be careful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nene and Dr. Sajan. So we have come to the end of this wonderful session on COVID-19. We have touched almost every topic. Due to lack of time, it's my sincere apology to all the audience. I could not take some of the questions. But anyway, I think we have touched everything. Just in conclusion, I would like to say one important thing also, that COVID-19 has a social and psychological impact also. Patient, again, those who have psychologically disturbed because of the pandemic, even they are not infected with COVID or infected with COVID, we have to look into their psychological aspect also, because again, this kind of psychological impact actually add to their symptoms, or patient suffering will also increases. So that part has to be also taken care. Finally, I would like to thank the topic master, Dr. Amita Nene from Mumbai, and Dr. Sajan from Kerala for their excellent opinions, and they are sharing their experience on COVID-19 in an Indian scenario. That is, we are very eager to hear, and we have already more than thousands participants have already listened to your experiences, and hope this is going to change their practices or their concept, and they will enlighten those who have listened to both of you. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir, once again. And in conclusion,
I'd like to thank you profusely for being an excellent moderator and conducting a great job. Thank you, Dr. Shahjahan. Thank you, Dr. Krishna, Dr. Pradyumna and Dr. Narendra, Dr. Ravidosi, and Dr. Vijay Kumar Chinamchetty. And I just want to say that there's always a light at the end of the darkest tunnel, and we shall survive this, and we will emerge as the winners. The time will
and I would like to thank the CCA Council of India President Dr. Narendra, General Secretary Dr. Ravidosi, our CCA Chairman Trustee Dr. N.S. Krishna, Dr. Narayan Pradeep, and CCA Webinar Coordinator Dr. Vijay Kumar. For a special thanks from everyone because of their effort and support, and actually a communication skill and helps. This program has been made possible. And so with this, I would like to conclude today's program. Thanks all of you once again, and we will hope to see again and meet, and we'll discuss another issues regarding COVID or any other things. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you very much.